this morning with the musical stylings of our local band leader, the INR4 Orchestra, our very own Doc Severinsen. And without any further ado, Dan, if you'd like to, I think Dan's going to start off at the piano. Ladies and gentlemen, Dan Barker.
So what are the chances that we would have two great genius saxophone players here at this conference? Yesterday it was Dennis. Where did Dennis go? Oh, hi. And then today it's David Ince stepping up to the plate. So next year, how about drums and a bass? And I know Chris DiCarlo. Are you here, Chris, or did you? He's sleeping in probably on the Lord's Day, the day of rest. Chris plays the drums. We played up in Ontario a few years ago. We played drums and piano. So if any of you plays the bass, let me know. Here's a song that I was privileged to write with the Broadway composer, Charles Strauss. Charles Strauss is in his 80s. He's still alive. He's going strong. He's the composer who wrote Annie, The Sun Will Come Up Tomorrow, and he wrote Bye Bye Birdie and a bunch of great songs, including Those Were the Days. So he gave a talk at one of our conferences, and he said, I've been an atheist my whole life. And I've never written a song about religion or belief or atheism. So he said, if you send me some lyrics, I'll set them to music. So I did, and he did. And here's the song. It's called Poor Little Me, with a nod to Yip Harburg. See if you get this. The multitudes mumble mythologies without end. But me, I have trouble with ologies that pretend to show what can't be shown, to know what can't be known. Lutherans have liturgies, Calvinists have creeds, Muslims have their minarets, Catholics have their beads, Methodists have methods, holy truth to ascertain. But poor little me, I only have a brain. Bishops transubstantiate, Shintos ring their bells, Transcendentalists meditate while Wiccans weave their spells. Hindus chant a mantra when they can't relieve the pain. But poor little me, I only have a brain. So fearful of the Netherland, believers band together, unhappy with the weatherman, the Zunies wave a feather. They dance in circles to demand the Great Spirit send some rain. But what do you do if you only have a brain? Quakers quake and Shakers shake, and Jews eat kosher food. Rastafarians wear their hair in pious gratitude. They all boast of miracles that no one can explain. But poor little me, I only have a brain. Fearful of the Netherland, believers band together, unhappy with the weatherman, the Zunies wave a feather. They dance in circles to demand Great Spirit send some rain. But what do you do if you only have a brain? Quakers quake and Shakers shake, and Jews eat kosher food. Rastafarians wear their hair in pious gratitude. They all boast of miracles that no one can explain, but poor little me, I only have a brain. And that was Charles Strauss, and what a genius with music. I never would have imagined chords like that. Those of you who are musicians know what I'm saying. They don't fit, but they fit. You know what I mean? It's one of those creative, artistic things that he did. And different styles of music. My mother was a lover of country music, and she died 10 years ago. And country music's not my thing, but I appreciate a good, sincere song. And Mom had a lot of fun. She had a sign in her kitchen, I'm only in it for the love, you know. That was how she was, and so country is part of our heritage. We went down to Texas a couple years ago, Annie, Laurie, and I. Did you get up yet, Annie, Laurie? Are you awake? Oh, there she is, okay. If there's anything sacred to Annie, Laurie, it's sleeping in, especially on Sunday mornings. We do have a bus sign and a billboard that says, sleep in on Sundays, you know. But anyway, we went to Texas to protest Governor Perry, who organized a prayer rally at Reliant Stadium in Houston. And we didn't think a governor from his office should be organizing and planning a prayer rally. The governor of a state, you know. He's a secular governor, right? Although he's got his weird religious views. You know, he's the governor who, remember a couple years ago, they had a huge drought in Texas, and Governor Perry had a prayer rally for it, and then the state caught fire. Remember that? So this song is dedicated to Governor Rip Van Periwinkle, who overslept not 20, but 2,020 years. It's called Get Off Your Knees and Get to Work. If you find yourself to be a resident of the Capitol or of the City Hall, as governor or mayor or as president, you're a public servant to us all. You were not elected as our pastor-in-chief, and preaching on the job is not a perk. Govern us with reason and not belief. Get off your knees and get to work. Get off your knees and start thinking. The answers will be found right here on earth. Unbow your head and open your eyes. Get off your knees and get to work. It makes no actual difference what you say to God. He may as well be Santa or an elf. Every time you bow your head and pray to God, you are only talking to yourself. If you run your office with propriety, your First Amendment duties you won't shirk. Everybody's tired of your piety. Get off those knees and get to work. Get off your knees and start thinking. The answers will be found right here on earth. Unbow your head and open your eyes. Get off your knees and get to work. Prayer won't. I have to get off my knees and wake up. Faith won't fix the budget. Prayer won't pay the bills. Hope will never nudge it. But taxing churches will. Get off your knees and start thinking. The answers will be found right here on earth. Unbow your head and open your eyes. Get off your knees and get to work. I played a bunch of songs by secular composers, George Gershwin, Cole Porter. Cole Porter actually had to come out of two closets. Jerome Kern and Yip Harburg, who wrote Somewhere Over the Rainbow, was a non-believer. And the Freedom from Religion Foundation published a collection of his light verse poetry. He wasn't just a lyricist of famous songs like It's Only a Paper Moon and April in Paris, but he was a very strong social advocate, social consciousness. Yip Harburg worked for liberal causes and civil rights and all of that. But he wrote a lot of light verse that we got to republish with his son Ernie called Rhymes for the Irreverent. And my favorite of Yip Harburg's poems, light verses, is called Lead Kindly Light. Where Bishop Patrick crossed the street, an X now marks the spot. The light of God was with him, but the traffic light was not. Then he wrote a poem called Adrift on a Star, which is about science, and he was looking at the stars in the universe and what is our place in it and what is the meaning of life. He also had another little poem called On a Clear Day from Mount Wilson, You Can See Watts. So I stuck those two poems together to make a song called Adrift on a Star. With magic gear through stratosphere, beyond the stars we grope, but there's more to be found in the drop of a tear than there is in a telescope. Here we are, adrift on a star, alone in a silent sky, lost in space. Together we face the wonder of where and why. Why a sky without an end, a sea without a chart? Why the rain and why the rose? And why the trembling heart? Here we are, adrift on a star, and what is the journey for? Can it be the heart is the sea, and love is the golden shore? That wherever you are in this star-sprinkled dome, if there's love in your star, you're home, you're the heart is the sea, and love is the golden shore. That wherever you are in this star-sprinkled dome, if there's love in your star, you're home, you're home. did you know that the church outlawed the tango? Did you know that? So, of course, what did everybody want to dance? You know, the dance that the church outlawed, what could be more sexy than that, right? So, to fight back, beware of dogma. It has a bite. Beware of dogma. It wants a fight. Beware of dogma. It will ignite a holy war by itself. Beware of dogma. It'll trap your mind. Religious dogma. It'll make you blind. Beware of dogma. It's not designed to let you think for yourself. If we let it out in the universe, there will be no doubt everything is worse. Beware of dogma. Don't let it loose, that unchained dogma. It'll reproduce. Tie up your dogma. There's no excuse for ignorance anymore. Beware of dogma. Don't let it loose, that unchained dogma. It'll reproduce. Tie up your dogma. There's no excuse for ignorance anymore. Please, clean up after your dogma. That's a lot better than church, isn't it? Huh? One of the hardest things for anyone to admit, one of the hardest things for any person to say is, I was wrong. Isn't that hard to say? I was wrong. But if you're a fundamentalist pastor, not only is that hard, 10 times harder. Jerry, you know that. Was Jerry here somewhere hiding? Yeah. Oh. It's not just hard, it's also frightening. It's not just a hard thing to do, it's also like scary. It's like, because what if you're wrong? Most of you atheists have heard someone in your life come up to you and say, what if you're wrong? You go, well, yeah, I've thought of that. Yeah, if I'm wrong, but I'm not, and where's the evidence? But when you're talking to a fundamentalist, it means more than just some intellectual phrase like, what if you're wrong? Have you thought about the alternatives? It's scary. It's the core of your being, this whole idea of hell. And Muslims will say the same thing, right? This whole idea of what if you're wrong is a cosmic question. So it's not easy to just go wake up one day after you're a fundamentalist minister, after 19 years of preaching like I did, or was it 25 years for you, Jerry? You can stop calling me sir now. We're not in the, you know. Say yes, Lord. Yes, Bishop. I'm Bishop Barker, and he's Deacon DeWitt. That's what we've got going here. We're thinking, I don't know what we're going to do. We're thinking about doing a show together, a music preaching show. Wouldn't that be fun? But we got to come up with some material, but that would be a blast. Maybe next year or the year after we can come back and do the Bishop Deacon show or something. The Unholy Ghosts, okay. When I left the ministry in the mid-'80s, I thought I was the only one. I knew there were other atheists in the world. I knew that, but I didn't know any. It was just me. It was me and my thoughts. After all these years of preaching, one day in summer of '83, I realized I don't believe anymore. What does that make me? What is that? I mean, it wasn't like I was trying to become an atheist. It's like, oh, I like that word, this A thing, you know. But, so I guess I don't believe any of this, and I'll explain why in a minute. So I guess, I guess I'm not theist, I guess I'm an atheist. Oh, that's what I am. But I didn't know any others, and I didn't know if I would even like any of you. You know what I mean? It's like, I pictured atheists were these kind of selfish, overly rational, overly critical, hard people who just had no joy. They were just all pure science, and And I thought, I don't know what, So then I sent out a letter in January of 1984, still not having actually met any real known atheists. Well, I did meet an atheist once, but I didn't want to. I knew he was in a church, but I didn't actually meet him or talk to him. So I knew there was at least one in the world. But then a few months after sending out that letter to everybody that I'm not a preacher anymore, don't call me to preach, or if you do want to call me to preach, it'll be a totally different sermon. I got a call. I was working a temporary job transitioning in computer programming. I was doing assembly language programming, which I thought was fun, actually solving real problems in the real world, not just phony problems like what's going to happen to your soul when you die, but real problems, And a woman called, a producer from a show in Chicago called me. Said, we're doing a show about atheism. And I had written an article. I had already written a piece for Free Thought Today, which I heard about. I had read one of Annie Laurie's books. And she says, we're going to have Annie Laurie and her mom on the show, and could you come in, because your story's interesting too. You were a preacher, and now you're an atheist? What a story. So I said, well, okay. So I got on the plane in California, flew to Chicago, and the host of the show was a young woman named Oprah Winfrey. And I'd kind of heard of her. She was just becoming nationally known. It was a few months later that Oprah Winfrey got her, was it like early 85, I think it was, when her show finally went national. So that's the first day that I met Annie Laurie and her mom, Ann, and another atheist woman on that show. It was the first day I knowingly met any other atheists. And I don't know who was more nervous, them or me, because, what if I had reconverted right on TV, right? I'm sorry, I was wrong. And then I was kind of like, well, these atheist people, they seem nice, but what? And then you could see during the show, you can go online and see that show. Somebody, Oprah lost all those shows, and the producers don't even know where they are, but one of our members happened to record it on a VHS and sent it to us. So we have a kind of jumpy, grainy version, and you can go online and see that, the day that we met. And you can see us relaxing during the show. Okay, we're among friends here. Did some of you come to this meeting wondering? Did any of you am I going to like these people or not? And then you just say, hey, this is great. We're just people. We're among friends, and atheists and agnostics are just people too, like everyone else. One of the first songs I wrote was Friendly Neighborhood Atheists. We're just people. It's not like we have horns or something. So that show was the first time I had ever publicly spoken about my atheism. Before that time, I hadn't said a thing to anyone, really. And then a couple weeks later, I spoke before a group in Los Angeles. So that show was the very first time I'd actually said anything publicly. And you can see on the show that I'm like groping to say these words that today they just flow out, But it was building them at that time. You could see the thoughts and all that. And not only was that the first time I spoke publicly about my atheism after preaching for 19 years, it was also the first time I'd ever spoken before a hostile audience. And I loved that. That was amazing. It was like, yeah, now I'm saying something that's making a difference. It's not like when you're in church preaching and some of you, there's some other former preachers here today too, former Pentecostal, Canada Pentecostal preacher. Where are you? Are you over here? Okay, yeah. So you're preaching and the audience is listening and they're praising God and they're with you, but they're looking at their watch because they have a roast in the oven, and they've got to get home, and it's that kind of a thing. And it's like, and they're all with you. It's like you don't have to prove yourself to them. But speaking before a hostile audience, I really just fell in love with that. And that's why I like doing debates. I know there's controversy about whether we should debate or not, but I can't help it. I'm sorry. I'm just maybe once a preacher, always a preacher. I'm not saying we should all do that or it's even the best thing in the world. But I have heard from people at debates who came and said, you got me thinking. And then they put them online. So a couple weeks ago, I did my 118th public debate at the University of Wisconsin, starting in 1985. That was Matt Slick, transcendental argument Calvinist, He's a devoted follower. I don't think he loves Jesus as much as he loves Calvin. It's like Calvin is their guy, Even though Calvin murdered his friend Servetus over the crime of suggesting that Jesus was the Son of the eternal God and not the eternal Son of God. Did you follow that? He did. That was the issue. And Calvin had surveyed his, Calvin could have stopped it, but he didn't. But in any event, Matt Slick is this Calvinist. And so I just love doing these debates. I've done 8 with Muslims, and I got to do one at Oxford, which was really fun, with the bow ties and the parliamentary, the whole toast to the Queen, and then all these. That was really a blast. So I guess once a preacher, always a preacher. And it's really interesting to be able to say something that's making a difference, that's making people either shocked or upset. It's not like you want them to be upset. It's not like I enjoy you having your feelings hurt, but that you want to say something that makes a difference. There's a differential there. There's a disconnect. There's a, in the brain. And I wonder, when I was a fundamentalist minister, where were you? Why did none of you come up to me and say something? Why was it always praise and adulation? Why was I always, why when I was preaching on the street corners, when I was out going out, where were you skeptics to come up and say at least one little thing to me? It wouldn't have changed my mind overnight. I would have thought you were nuts, but at least I would have known there was some disagreement, At least I would have known that there's somebody was registering that they did not agree with me. It was like an inflated thing. It's like we're always being, when you're within that circle, there's a sort of in-group bias the sociologists talk about. We're in this in-group. We know what's true. And I wish one of you had come up and just said a word. You wouldn't have to be mean about it. And you know what I think? Ridicule would have made a difference. If you had ridiculed me, I would have not liked to be ridiculed, and I would have thought, why are they ridiculing me? That makes me feel uncomfortable. I think ridicule can go a long way, as long as that's not all we're doing. If all you're doing is ridiculing, well, then where's your arguments? But a little bit of ridicule can really work. So I would have liked one of you to come up and say something to me. We ministers don't know what the heck we're talking about. We don't, but we have nothing to say, but we say it beautifully. You know what I mean? Have you ever been to any of those services where you leave going, wow, that was amazing, but what did he say, And we're good at that, and after a while we hone these skills. I went to, I accepted a calling. I thought I was called to the ministry, and at the time I was convinced of it because I had goosebumps. When I was 15 years old, I was sitting in church, and the preacher was talking about go into the whole world and preach the gospel to every creature. And I thought, that's what I want to do with my life, because Jesus is coming any minute. Jesus is going to return. And I thought, it could be tonight, like a thief in the night. It could be any moment. And what's more important than people's eternal destiny, right? So I became that guy on campus. You know who I'm talking about? With the Bible under his arm, overly confident. You didn't know it, but it was your lucky day when God directed you to sit next to me on a bus. You didn't know it. All things, the Bible says all things work together for good, right? The Bible says that. So it wasn't chance. It wasn't random. It was God bringing you to me because I knew that what I had was so precious and real and loving and truthful and eternal that once you saw it and heard it, you would be hungering for this message. So I felt it was a good motivation. I didn't feel like I was insulting anyone. I thought what I was doing for you was a big favor. Don't you hate people like that? I really thought it was a great favor I was doing to you. So Bill, you're sitting next to me on the bus. Excuse me for saying this, but I can see you're going through some real struggles in your life right now, aren't you? How does he know? And I'm sorry, I don't want to, intrude, but you're having a real problem with some relationships in your personal life right now, aren't you? Yeah. Well, I used to feel the same way. I used to wonder what it's all about and, what's the meaning of life? Why am I here? Where's the guidebook for my existence? And how do I know what choices to make? And where's the operation manual for our lives? And you know what? I felt the same way. I felt lost and empty until I found the answer. Well, I'm not going to say anymore. I'm embarrassing myself, but I preached on street corners, and I preached in Mexico, and I was a missionary to Mexico for 2 years. Really? It wouldn't be until you put money in the plate. That's when And you know what? You're not like that, but there's an awful lot of people in the world who are susceptible to that kind of talk. None of you in this room would fall for that, would you? You wouldn't. I mean, I can imagine what you would say back to someone like me. And where were you back then? In 19 years, where was one of you at least to say something to me? Too polite. Well, don't be too polite. You can be polite, but at least, you wouldn't have had to argue with me. You wouldn't have had to preach. You wouldn't have had to do anything. Just express the fact that you disagree. That's all. You should come up and give the talk. So I went to Azusa Pacific College. It's a university now. Got a degree in religion. It wasn't a great school. It was an okay liberal arts Christian college. And I took 2 years of New Testament Greek, which was just enough to kind of look halfway intelligent from the pulpit, I can translate from the New Testament, but what's the use? Nobody's coming to church to hear Greek, right? But every once in a while during my sermon, I would say, the Apostle Paul told us that he was a slave of Christ. And in the Greek, that word slave is doulos. He must know something. He knows the Greek, right? We preachers don't know what the heck we're talking about. We really don't, As Jerry said yesterday, he was trying to quote me. Theology is a subject with no object. It really is. What's the object? What's the object of study? Theologians just study each other. That's all they're reading each other. And that you can get a degree in that. You can make money in that. You can live a whole life studying something that has no object of study to it. It's just, thoughts. But I preached in 3 California churches. One was a Friends church, which was, the Friends is like the West Coast Quakers, you know what I mean. The California Friends tradition is what Richard Nixon came out of, which I'm not bragging about, I'm just saying, yeah. And the Friends were more of a evangelical kind of Quakerism, still denying the sacraments, but less like the old-fashioned Quakers. Then I went into a Pentecostal church, Assembly of God. And that was more in line with my dad's background and his life. All the speaking in tongues and faith healing and the discernment of spirits. I could come up to you with my hand and I could see if there were any evil spirits within you that needed to be cast out, Did you do that in your church, Jerry? Discernment of... Did you have any evil spirits yourself? I think that's why. And faith healing, at one time, Gary was this big bass in one of our quartets. We were in Mexico City, and Gary was supposed to preach that night. We alternated preaching. And Gary said, I can't preach tonight. I lost my voice. I'm sorry, I can't preach. And before the meeting, we would get in a huddle and pray, dear God, bless this ministry tonight. Yes, dear Lord. And I laid my hands on Gary, and I said, Jesus, heal Gary's throat so he can preach the gospel tonight. In the name of Jesus, Gary, be healed. And Gary said, praise the Lord. It really happened. That really happened. And I got to tell you, if you're in a faith system like that and something like that happens, it's terribly affirming, Of course, I ignored the 99 times when nothing happened or when worse things happened. There's this confirmation bias. You talk about the successes, right? And I used to say, I had no idea what happened. It really happened. I have to say that. And he got up and he preached and he sang. And I thought maybe it was autosuggestion or whatever. But a couple years ago, a doctor came up to me and said, there is this thing called a laryngeal spasm. When somebody's really tired and nervous and your larynx kind of freezes up. And then if you can relax and breathe and something, you can overcome that. And maybe, I can't go back and reproduce that, but at least there's one plausible naturalistic explanation for what happened. I've since learned that it's irresponsible to just quickly jump to the supernatural when you don't have an answer for something. But I spent a couple years in Mexico trying to convert Catholics into Christians. And it worked. I learned that if you're ever going to preach in one of these Latin American countries, I'm not suggesting you do that, but if you are, you need to say something about Mary in your sermon. Somewhere, mention Mary, the mother of Jesus, and you're in. Just mention, because there's something about the, mother of Jesus. Then I was at that Pentecostal church I was there for a year and a half, and those people were really sweet and really sincere people. but way too noisy for my tastes, if you know what I mean. Just all the hollering and slaying in the Spirit. You know what that means, being slain in the Spirit? Where they pray and then they fall back, and these women are shaking on the ground like this. And I read a psychologist once suggest there's more going on there than we realize, but I don't want to go there. Jesus is their boyfriend, their lover, and, they want to go back home to their husband, but they want to, come to church. But anyway, see, there's a good reason to come to church, right? There's got to be some reason. And then I was at an independent Christian church out of the Disciples of Christ, which was charismatic. And then that church sent me out as an evangelist for 8 years, and I preached the gospel, thinking the world was going to end any minute, preaching living by faith. And those of you who are raised in a kind of evangelical tradition know that the phrase living by faith means something different than what the mainstream churches might say. Living by faith means that you actually live without any plans or structure. All of our stuff was in storage. We had no income. We didn't use contracts. We just went from church to church, trusting there would be a love offering to pay. In the car after the service, we'd look in the envelope to see if there was enough cash to get to the next church. 8 years thinking Jesus was coming again, and he was going to return. And darn it, he kept on delaying, I since learned, of course, that every generation of Christians has had its subset that has imagined that they were living in the end times. I thought, wow, how lucky am I? Not only was I born in the right family, in the right religion, in the right country, but in the right time of history, to be right now on the edge when Jesus is coming again. Well, the Millerites in the 1830s, right? The Jehovah's Witnesses in 1914. Oops, 1925, right? Any ex-Jehovah's Witnesses here? There you go. James Rutherford and Charles Russell, and then they thought it was going to end. And then 1975, and then other times, and even in the New Testament, Jesus told his disciples, some of you won't taste death until you see the kingdom coming. So there was this sort of flattering thing that I was on the front line of this army at the right time of history to usher in the new world. There was this whole thing in the brain, and what do you call that? What would psychologists call that? Delusion? It was a delusion. I don't think a delusion is a mental illness. Some people do. I don't think I was mentally ill. I was smart, but I think a delusion is something else, the God delusion that Dawkins wrote about. There's something real that's going on in the brain, and it happened to me. I spent 8 years traveling the country. I wrote some Christian musicals. I was down in the basement of a church, and I wrote a musical that we were going to play back in the church in California. A friend of mine told me that Man of Music was looking for a Christmas musical. So I went in there. I was 25. I went in with my little penciled manuscript. I wrote this musical for Christmas for the children to put on with like puppets and things, And I went into Burbank, California, and Carl Farrer, the vice president, said, all right, let's see what you got. I was kind of scared, publishing company. So I put up my little penciled manuscript on the piano, and I just started playing the introduction. And he grabbed my arm. He said, stop. I said, what? Stop, I can tell you right now. We're going to publish this. It's going to be good. It's going to be one of our best sellers, and this is great. And I said, but you haven't heard anything. And he said, I've heard enough. I know. Besides that, we were praying for God to bring in the children's music for Christmas, and you brought it in, so it's an answer to our prayers. And they did. They didn't change a thing. They published it, and it's still selling. I'm still getting royalties today from that 1976 musical. And I followed it up. It was called Mary Had a Little Lamb. It was the name of it. Who's laughing? If you're laughing, it's because you lack spiritual insight. Mary's the mother of Jesus, and Jesus is the Lamb of God. Get it? Mary had a little lamb, right? And then they wanted a follow-up for Easter, so the next year I wrote an Easter musical, and guess what that title was? His fleece was white as snow, right? Which also has deep theological implications, because the final Passover lamb was supposed to be the pure lamb, unspotted by sin, and Jesus was not a sinner. He became the final Passover sacrifice. His fleece was white as snow. Get it? And that one also did well. So I became a Christian songwriter / preacher. And my sermons, I started meeting all these different cross-section of Christians, and my sermons started migrating from end of the world, hellfire, what are you going to do when you die? I started preaching less about the afterlife and started preaching more about this life. After all, the world wasn't ending, and my kids were growing up, and and then there's more things to preach about. And when you go to church on Sunday morning, it's mostly stuff like that you hear. How do you let your light shine before men and all that? And what happened was becoming a Christian songwriter threw me into a broader cross-section of Christianity. I didn't jump from fundamentalist to atheist in one night. You don't do that. You don't just wake up one morning and you go, oh, silly me, there's no God, oh, ha, 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 ha. You don't do that. You can't, because it's your whole being. To say that you were wrong as a fundamentalist, to admit I was wrong, you just can't do that. It was a gradual process, but what helped my process was that I started meeting a broader cross-section of Christians. Most of my deconversion happened within Christianity. Most of the critical work that discredits the Bible is done by Christians, Christian scholars who are doing the work. So I started meeting these other pastors and Christians from different denominations from mine, the untrue ones, right, that weren't like mine. And it bothered me that they would have different points of view. And like what Jerry said yesterday about Adam and Eve, that was an early thing with me. I met with a pastor of a Baptist church, and before we got in the prayer huddle, before the meeting, dear God, bless Dan Barker's ministry tonight so that souls will come to the kingdom. But then after the prayer, the pastor turned to me and he said, you know, we have some people in our church who don't think Adam and Eve were historical. And I thought, what? And you let them be members? What? That's calling the Bible a lie. And he said, don't get me wrong, I think they were historical. I'm sure they were, but these people think that just like when Jesus made up stories, what's a parable? A parable is a story that's made up. Was there really a prodigal son in history? It didn't matter. It didn't matter if it didn't even have a name, the prodigal son. It was a story that Jesus made up, the parables, to tell an important moral lesson. That's what the parables were. And if Jesus could make up stories to teach an important tale, these members of my church, the pastor told me, believe that the early Israelites also came up with a parable or a metaphor for the origin of sin in the human race, but that there didn't actually have to be a real Adam and a real Eve. And I thought that was heresy. I thought that was horrible. How can people think like that? But what happened in my brain, I remember this, I didn't convert to atheism right there. I remember thinking, oh, those people are wrong, and they're really bad, and it's heretical, but that shouldn't stop me from fellowshipping with those people, because they're doing the best they can. They're good people. What that was, it was changing a fundamentalist into more of a moderate, a little more liberal, a little more, and I thought, oh, I'm growing up, I'm getting sophisticated now, I'm getting a little more subtle. I don't have to be like those total crazy fundamentalists. I can be a little more, and that started a process in my mind that moved all the way across gradually, and I tell the whole story in my books. My 1992 book is called Losing Faith in Faith, From Preacher to Atheist, published by FFRF. And in 2008, a commercial publisher saw how well it was doing as a quote-unquote self-published book, wanted to get it into stores. So I brushed it up, and I brought it up to date after 16 years of experiences. And the book came out as Godless. And Godless is now in bookstores. You can find it. And Losing Faith in Faith is in a few bookstores, but we don't have that kind of distribution. So either book tells the story of why and how I moved. I got to the end, to make a long story really short, I realized, okay, if the prodigal son is a parable, and if Adam and Eve are a metaphor, then what other character in the Bible is also a metaphor? Where do you draw that line? Like Jerry said yesterday, where do you draw that line? If Adam and Eve, and this pastor told me even back then, he said, these members of my church know that there couldn't have been an Adam and Eve because of evolution. And even if there were, it wouldn't have come out of the Middle East, it would come out of Africa, And I got to thinking, evolution, well, that's bad, And so, but eventually I fell in love with science as I was reading more and more. I think my brain was growing up too. I get in my early 30s. Something about the frontal lobe in some of us takes a long time to finish developing. I've heard it said that it's faster with women than with men, which might explain a lot. But I don't know if that's true. But in any event, I don't think anything was really happening up there until I was about 30. Some of you knew it when you were 6, right? Annie Laurie's dad was a little kid in southern Missouri going to church, and one day he looked around. How old was he, 7 or 9 or something? And he looked around the church and he realized, my parents are nuts. Why did it take me so long? Why did it take, some of you know what I'm talking about. Why were some of you just like that? And some of us were like, maybe it's because I fall over here on the bell curve of whatever you call it, susceptibility to gullible, I don't know what you call it. I didn't quite hear voices, but I was just like right about there. So I realized, well, okay, the prodigal son, Adam and Eve, well, maybe Yahweh is also just one big figure of speech. Maybe Yahweh doesn't actually have to be like the prodigal son. We don't care if it actually exists or not. Doesn't that sound like liberal talk, like liberal pulpit talk? So eventually I realized, I got to the end and I dumped out all the bath water. And I thought, hey, there's no baby there. There's just, man, it was kind of scary. It was frightening. It was like, whoa. And it was the kind of frightening that's a mixed blessing kind of frightening. Maybe it's like skydiving, which I would love to do. The big problem is keeping it from Annie Laurie. I wouldn't, I would love to go skydiving someday, but don't tell her if I ever do that, right? Because maybe it's not that wise. But, or mountain climbing maybe, or something else that you're doing that's scary and fun at the same time. That's how I felt. Oh, this is, and I tell stories in the book about that mission church I was in Mexico, where it dawned on me that I was all alone in the universe. I was looking up at the stars, and for the first time in my life, I realized I'm all alone in this room. There's no ghosts or devils or spirits judging me, or there's no principalities and powers and eternal cosmic forces, and none of that. It's just me. And just like those stars up there that are ingesting material and then burning it up and shining, and then they burn out someday, I'm one of these little low wattage stars. I'm ingesting material and kind of glowing faintly in this universe, and I'm going to die someday. That's it. That's who I am. And that's all. And that's enough, and that's more than enough. To realize that, it was almost like I was shaking hands with myself for the first time. Hey, Dan, you're an animal. Thanks for the compliment, That's what we are. We are biological organisms. And that was really an interesting thing to be able to do, to switch out of that mind. If you're talking to a fundamentalist, don't hesitate, but keep in mind that fundamentalists are speaking a different language. You might be using the same words, but talking past each other, You might be talking in relativistic, contrafactual, situational terms, and in their minds, it has to be black or white. Even the Bible says, Jesus said in Revelation, you should be cold or hot, because if you're lukewarm, I'll spit you out of my mouth. Fundamentalists can't stand gray area. They can't stand relatives. It all has to be, it's a polarized thing. Whatever you say to them is going to flip this way or that. And you think you're talking in a kind of sophisticated, more, way to them, but in their mind, you might talk about individual freedom to control our own bodies and reproductive future and all that, and they're going to think baby killer, right? You might be talking about how situational ethics in different contexts could be, maybe it's the same action could be wrong. They're going to think reprobate. In their minds, it's going to go one way or the other. So sometimes we have to back up and find a back way around to talk to fundamentalists. But talk about the Bible, that would have impressed me a lot, and talk about morality. The big question for me at the end then was, well then, if there is no afterlife, what's the meaning of life? What's the purpose? Why are we here? Why are we here, Bill? What is the purpose as you're sitting there in that bus seat? What is the operation manual? What is your meaning in life? I have a book coming out, my next book's coming out, and for very good reasons is being delayed until the beginning of next year or the end of this year. It's called Life-Driven Purpose. And most of you know what that is. That's Rick Warren's book, Purpose-Driven Life. I think Rick Warren has it upside down. Rick Warren thinks that we have to look outside of ourselves to find a purpose, like if you're a member of an army, or if you're a slave and you have a plantation owner that tells you what you must do, and then you do your job, and then you get praised for doing your right job. What should I do? How can I live my life? And the publisher is really hoping, and now with this new distributor, that this will be the very first atheist book on the inspirational bookshelves. All those Osteen and Warren books about find your true purpose and find your true meaning. And I think we atheists and agnostics can use the word inspired, inspirational. I think we are inspired and believers are outspired. They need it to come from outside of themselves. And for me, one of the most liberating concepts was the really good news, truly good news. It's better than the gospel. And this might sound counterintuitive. It might even sound wrong. The really great news that we atheists offer to the world is that there is no purpose of life. That's wonderful news. Because if there were a purpose of life, we would be secondary. We would be under some orders, some, slave master or whatever. In fact, the Bible, even Paul in the Bible said he was a slave of Christ. And the Greek word for that is doulos. Did you? He's a slave. I really know what I'm talking about. To say there's no purpose of life, which is great news, it really is, it's a liberating news, does not mean there's no purpose in life. There's plenty of purpose in life. And who would dare say someone like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, for example, didn't have purpose in her life as she was working to solve a real problem? As long as there's problems to solve, or knowledge to gain, or beauty to create, or some obstacle to overcome, or inequality to eradicate, or hunger to lessen, or you name it. One of your siblings catches some horrible disease and dies from it. That wasn't handed you from above. You decide yourself, I'm going to fight that disease, or whatever it is. As long as there are those problems, there's purpose in life. We non-believers have immense life-driven purpose, not purpose-driven lives. Our lives are what drive the purpose. Do I have time for one song before we could? Okay. My shoe came untied. And some of that came from Richard Dawkins' book, Unweaving the Rainbow, which I heard him say once was his favorite book, and I think it is a gorgeous book, where he makes a plea within that book to integrate science into the arts. If we could make science more artistic and more palatable and more fun and more approachable, rather than just a bunch of pinheads and coats kind of thing, but make science assume it. So inspired by that, I dedicated the song to Dawkins, which just assumes the fact of evolution. Thanks to Galileo for showing us our humble place in outer space. And thanks to Mr. Darwin for showing us the origin of the human race, which means that our precious romance is mainly the product of chance. And these feelings of love so frenetic are just genetic. It's only natural that I would want you. It's only natural that you want me. A million years of evolution had its way, so we can blame it on our parents' DNA. I move instinctively in your direction. Somehow you signal me to turn and see. You will always be my natural selection. As a voluntary choice, naturally.
natural that I would want you. It's only natural that you want me. A million years of evolution had its way, so we can blame it on our parents' DNA. I move instinctively in your direction. Somehow you signal me to turn and see. You will always be my natural selection. As a voluntary choice. As a voluntary choice. You're my voluntary choice. Determined but voluntary. Naturally.
Thanks, Dan.